Hello and welcome to this new episode of the long-term reading project on James Joyce's novel Ulysses. This video is about the sixth episode of the novel, and if you're new to this project, I recommend starting from the beginning, and because all the previous videos are compiled in this playlist. So the sixth episode is the so-called Hades episode, and my video is divided into the following chapters, which you can also select individually by using the timestamps below. So our first chapter is a brief summary of the plot, as usual. And the second chapter is the largest one, where I'll try to give 4 thematic cross-sections through the episode. And 3 of these 4 thematic cross-sections are using terms from the Gilbert scheme. And these 4 sections are about incubism, which is mentioned in the Gilbert scheme as the narrative technique of this episode. Then it's about the organ of the heart. The third one is about this grave digger or custodian of the cemetery, and the fourth is about Leopold Bloom's 3 companions in the carriage on his way to the cemetery. Then the third chapter of the video is about parallels to the Odyssey, to the original Odyssey, and fourth chapter is on what is the place of this episode in the structure of the novel so far up to that point. Fifth chapter, a few words about the local color in Dublin and Ireland, as it is described, and it is very present in the novel. And then the sixth chapter is more a methodological one, triggered by some questions or comments from your side. It's about what I present here, or what others present here in the comments. Is this over-interpretation? Is this excessive speculation, or is it a legitimate way to read this novel? Okay, so let's start with the first chapter of my video, a brief summary of the plot. So it's 11 a.m. in the morning. It's the time of the funeral service for Bloom's acquaintance, Patrick Dingham, and so Bloom wants to attend, and so he travels with other 3 companions, with other 3 acquaintances of the deceased, in a closed carriage from Digham's home in South Dublin to the Catholic cemetery Glasnevin in the north of the city. So, and a few words about the fellow passengers. One of these is Simon Dedalus, so it's Stephen Dedalus' father. But there's also present a certain Martin Cunningham. It's a compassionate, warm-hearted man. And there's Mr. Power, who's a rather thoughtless, conventional character who stands out more for his platitudes than for his original intellectual depth. The conversation in the carriage, it revolves around the deceased Patrick Dingham, about mourning traditions, about Irish history and politics, about societal gossip, and also briefly about first Stephen Dedalus and then about Buck Mulligan, because they catch a glimpse, at least of Buck Mulligan, as they drive past in the carriage. And in addition to the description of the external events, the reader also gains repeatedly some insight into the thoughts of Leopold Bloom, which in this episode revolve around the themes of death, decay, funeral rites of different cultures, religious ideas about the afterlife, but also about anatomical details and the suicide of Bloom's father and the premature death of his son Rudy. And so Bloom is quite detached and preoccupied with his own thoughts, and in this mode, preoccupied and detached mode, he experiences both the funeral service and the chapel on the cemetery, and also the actual burial ceremony, and also the small talk between the mourners and their cemetery caretaker, John O'Donnell. Okay, let's move on to the second part, the second chapter of my video. These four thematic cross sections in this episode. So I've already mentioned this so-called Gilbert scheme a few times. This is a kind of deciphering key that James Joyce himself created for friends to help them understand the novel better. And three of these four thematic cross sections I would like to present are actually based on terms and words that are mentioned in the Gilbert scheme in reference to the Hades episode. So first, Joyce uses the word incubism as a word to describe the narrative technique applied in this episode. And this is incubism is a word he made up. It's a neologism by James Joyce, which seems to be deliberately ambiguous. The most obvious meaning, namely as a derivation of the word of the Latin word incubus, and this meaning seems to me to be the most misleading one. This word incubus means a male demon who haunts sleeping women at night, and um, but there are other meanings in Romance languages. For example, in Italian, incubo means um, simply nightmare in a much more general way than incubus means. And on the other hand, incubism, if you try to translate it literally from the medieval layman's Latin, it could also be translated as being packed into cubes or into cubicles, into boxes. And I think that is exactly what this episode is about. It's about being boxed in. So the corpse in the coffin, which is a wooden box with clearly defined and dimensions. This is emphasized several times in this episode. Even when Leopold Bloom thinks about alternative burial techniques, such as how to bury corpses in a much more space-saving way, so that is vertically, he thinks about spatially confined chambers, imagining them to be similar to the hexagonal spaces in honeycombs, for example. Or most of the, or a large part of the episode takes place in a closed carriage, so also in a box, in a rather claustrophobic situation. And then there is this allusion to a fear that was widespread at the turn of the last century, between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. That is the fear of being accidentally buried alive. So that is of being only apparently dead and then but not really dead, and then waking up again in the grave. And so that was a really a fear that was very common in this time. And so this episode repeatedly deals on many levels with the actual spatial imprisonment, with being trapped in a box in a very confined condition. So this being boxed in, sometimes also in sort of nightmarish scenarios. So this is how I understand this term incubism, and it's not really a narrative technique. It's more a cross-cutting theme, a leitmotif in this episode, I would say. Okay, so a brief digression, a nerdy one. So about this fear of being accidentally buried alive, that was, as I mentioned, actually very widespread in the 18th and 19th century, and there are some interesting aspects to this, because this led to a whole series of technical inventions that seem very bizarre to us today, such as coffins with rescue mechanisms, such as belts and ventilation openings, or complicated wiring to some device above ground, and so on. So I give you a few drawings, technical drawings of these sort of inventions here. Some of them were even patented. So and there were other aspects of this. Some people stipulated in their wills that their veins should be severed after death had been confirmed, just to make sure that they really were really dead and they did not wake up half alive underground. I think this is also mentioned in the text, this to cutting the veins after people have died. So what was the cause for this fear? So I think the cause for this fear lay in a lack of knowledge about death. At that time, there were very imperfect methods of diagnosing death, and there was also a very lively folklore tradition about people being buried alive and working hard to make their way out of the grave. So I think this is the context, a little bit of context here, and to this fear. And I think these scenarios also play a role in Leopold Bloom's thought experiments in the cemetery. So I think can see incubism in this sense as a nightmarish feeling of being boxed in several examples in this episode. Just to mention a few, you can see this in these oppressive confines of the carriage, this claustrophobic situation. If you decide to go through the text to the description again, you might notice how many subtle linguistic means are used here by Joyce to create this claustrophobic atmosphere of confinement in this carriage situation. Then there is this obsessive, narrow circling of Leopold's thoughts around death and decay and coffins and burial. His thoughts are boxed into a very small compartment, a very small box of this topic: death, decay, putrefaction, and etc. And then there is this effect of nested cubicles. So the carriage, the coffin, the grave. So the body is in the box, and the coffin is in the carriage, and then will be transformed into a grave. And then let's talk about also decay gases. They're entrapped or enclosed in coffins, and they bring death even when they escape. And bystanders inhale these gases. So it's also again a sort of a trap. Can be a death trap. So yeah, as usual, I'm not going to provide a comprehensive list of all the references in the text, but rather invite you to read the text with this structure, with these ideas in mind, and look for this leitmotif of being boxed in the text. Just a few words on interpretation and meaning. In the previous episode, we noted that Joyce presents Leopold Bloom as limited or constrained by a whole series of forces, primarily forces from his personal and family environment. And here in this episode, Joyce depicts Bloom's dilemma, or the dilemma of humanity in general, even more clearly, or on a higher level, or with a different perspective. Humanity is surrounded by death. So that's part of the human predicament. Life is a short and very fragile period of time. So before us and after us and around us, there is death. And it's like a box in which we are trapped before we enter the last box for our final destination. And for me, two very closely related sentences in this episode are crucial, are central. First, the phrase, which is actually a common traditional spiritual or even biblical saying. So in the midst of life, we are in death. Now, it's not biblical. I think it was invented or created by a monk in the 7th or 8th century. So the original Latin version is media vita in morte sumus. So in the midst of life, we are in death. And this sentence is formulated from explicitly Christian perspective. It's a variation, more or less, on the Old Testament quote, memento mori. So teach us to remember, O Lord, that we must die, so that having this knowledge always present, we may become wise people. So wisdom in life, therefore, consists in being constantly aware of how close we are to the end of our lives and how important it is to care for the salvation of our souls. And Leopold Bloom now, he reverses this phrase. It's not like in the midst of life we are in death, but he turns it the other way around. In the midst of death, we are in life. So we are surrounded by death, but we still live. So, and this is a different perspective. That's the perspective of modern man who no longer is so much focused or fixated on the afterlife as either a threat or a reward, but who perhaps also with an attitude of a little bit of defiance, rebels against death and says, no, death is not the thing that is important. I want to focus on the here and now, on this life. This is the real thing. This is the important thing. And the irony, however, of this episode is that Leopold Bloom, at least at this point in the story, he obviously does not succeed in doing so. He does not succeed in living according to this phrase that he coined. So he cannot escape his thoughts that are constantly revolving around death and decay. So he has not succeeded in this liberation act of really focusing on life. The second thematic cross-section is about the heart. So Joyce names the heart as the symbolic organ of this episode. And I think it's unmistakable clear that this heart is a very important organ here. I think it appears 23 times in the text of this episode. And unlike the kidney, which plays a special role in, I think, in the fourth episode, the word heart has a wonderfully multifaceted ambiguity. And I have the impression that in this episode, James Joyce deliberately plays with at least 3 different levels of meaning of the word heart. So sometimes even playing them off against each other. So that's the physiological, the emotional, and the religious, moral meaning of the word. So physiological, it's very clear. The heart, viewed from a purely anatomical perspective, it's just a hollow muscle. It's a pump, a life-sustaining machine. So completely demystified. So this is Bloom's train of thought here. The heart, it's ultimately just a pump, and it pumps thousands of gallons of blood every day. And one final day, boom, it's over. And there are lots of these broken pumps lying around here. Not only hearts, broken pumps, but lungs and livers and old rusty pumps. And also, Patrick Digham's cause of death is described quite technically, soberly, as just a broken pump, just heart failure. So, but there's also the emotional meaning of the word heart. The heart is the seat of our human emotions, and this also plays an important role in this episode. It's emphasized a couple of times. So, Simon Dedalus is described as being full of his son. So, his fatherly love is characterized, and the heart as emotionally filled with the love for his son. Or the grave, the caretaker's jokes, they are explicitly described as an expression of his kindness of heart. They are intended to distract the mourners, to cheer them up. It's his good, it's his pure good-heartedness at work. Or another example, when we talk about Mr. Cunningham, it's mentioned, it's stated that his heart is worn out by suffering. Mr. Martin Cunningham suffers from the behavior of his alcoholic wife. So it would, I think it's the text that it would wear out the heart out of a stone. That so even the heart of a stone would be worn out by this behavior. What he has to go through, and so there's the heart as a metaphor for the place of suffering, or for emotional resilience, or the absence of emotional resilience. And of course, the third one is this religious, moral level of meaning. The heart as the seat of the soul and of our intentions. So a nice example of this is the description of the heart and soul of the suicide victim. The text says, oh, they used to drive a stake of wood through his heart in the grave, as if it wasn't broken already. And so here in Leopold Bloom's thoughts, the heart metaphor combines, on the one hand, the Christian idea of the heart as the seat of the soul, via Bloom's compassionate irony, but it also indicates that the heart is also understood as the seat or the place of moral suffering. And there is talk about the sacred heart of Jesus. So Bloom reflects on the symbol of the sacred heart, which connects the religious and the physiological levels. Of course, Bloom is a very pragmatic and practical, down-to-earth person. So he's not starting theological and metaphysical speculations, but he actually checks the image of the sacred heart of Jesus, and he checks it for physiological correctness, and then he reflects on the plausibility of the Christian belief in salvation. And also the heart and its connection to the belief in resurrection. So when this Mr. Cronin says, when the priest says, where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, this touches the innermost heart of man. And he is talking of the innermost heart as the seat of religious feeling. But then Bloom immediately reduces this to the physical reality. And he said things, oh yes, but what good does it do to the guy 6 feet under the earth when his broken pump is touched? So the heart is touched, and he will translate this into the broken pump is touched. That makes no sense at all. Okay, the last 3 examples also show nicely that these levels are not used in isolation by Joyce, but that he deliberately places them side by side or connects them and allowing them to merge and to interlink and to play off each other. Okay, third thematic cross-cutting theme is, according to Gilbert's scheme, this cemetery caretaker is the symbol of the episode. And as we are in the Hades episode, so Hades is the god of the underworld or the guardian of the underworld. So, and if the cemetery caretaker is supposed to be the symbol of this episode, then I think we are on the safe side if we equate him, Mr. O'Connell, the caretaker of the cemetery, with the god Hades. And just as Hades is married to a fertility goddess, Persephone, also O'Connell is married to a kind of fertility goddess, where after all his wife has given birth to 8 children, even though it is certainly not particularly romantic to be dated on a cemetery or to live in the official residence of a cemetery caretaker or a gravedigger. So the courtship and mating rituals of a cemetery caretaker, at least as Leopold Bloom's imagines them, they are truly amusing passages in this gloomy episode. So this cemetery caretaker, John O'Connell, he is not a Hades to be feared. He is an extremely kind administrator of death. He's friendly, he greets everyone, he never forgets a friend. He tells jokes out of the goodness of his heart. He just wants to distract and to cheer up the mourners. And so being caretaker for him, it's more a calling or an art than just an occupation. But he is a guardian at the interface between life and death, and like Hades is. And so he's also associated with the symbolic image of the keys, and which is an allusion to the words of Christ in the revelation of John. So I was dead, but behold, I am alive forevermore now, and I have the keys of death and Hades. So we have a fusion of ancient mythology and Christian tradition and understanding of the afterlife or the spiritual world. Well, taking a step back again, for me, the 2 symbols of the heart and of this graveyard caretaker, they are closely intertwined. So the heart is depicted on the physiological level as the boundary between life and death. So once the heart stops beating, then life is at an end, and the cemetery caretaker takes responsibility for the body. And also in the emotional dimension, they are connected. So the dead, they do not disappear completely from the life of the living. So even when the caretaker takes over the body, they remain in the hearts and the memories of those left behind, and the place where that the caretaker has taken care of, the cemetery, the grave, that's actually the place where the memory is also kept alive in a visible form. And there is an aspect of irony also here if you look at the characters. Despite his profession, this caretaker, he is actually the warm-hearted guy here. His good-heartedness is mentioned, or his kindness or warmth of heart. While on the other hand, the living hearts of the mourners, of the participants in the funeral service for Patrick Dingham, they are all characterized by selfishness, hypocrisy, and even anti-Semitism. More on that a little bit later. Okay, so then the fourth thematic cross-section of this episode um, is about the companions in the carriage. I don't want to go into all the details of the conversation, as that would be very complicated and lengthy, because the topics often change abruptly or they become fragmented. Nothing is really talked through to a logical end. But from this conversation, one can clearly see what different characters are crammed together here, or incubated here, as we scientists would say. Maybe this is another meaning of the word incubism. I will try to characterize each one of these three traveling companions first with a single sentence, and then explain this sentence in a bit more detail. So, Martin Cunningham, let's start with him. He is the compassionate Sisyphus who, despite his own domestic hell, has the emotional intelligence to recognize Bloom's vulnerability and also to protect him. And his sensitivity does not go unnoticed. It is recognized and appreciated by Bloom. He thinks about Cunningham, a sympathetic human man he is, intelligent and always a good word to say. And Cunningham's own tragic family situation is highlighted as remarkable, and in particular, the way how he deals with it is highlighted as remarkable. So his alcoholic wife, who's addicted to alcohol, she regularly pawns the furniture to finance her addiction, and he nevertheless, he's trying to start all over again every week, and to work hard to make a living for this family. His also, what I find noticeable is his role in seeking understanding when the conversation turns to the topic of suicide, and some of his fellow passengers, they condemn suicide as something, as a cowardice, and or as a great sin, and a great shame, and Cunningham, he advocates for a more lenient view of suicide. He says, "Oh, that why not? I think maybe it's just temporary insanity. We must look upon it with mercy." And so that's Martin Cunningham. Then there's Mr. Power, or Jack Power. He is quite the contrary. He is the thoughtless Orthodox Catholic who, without malice but also without empathy, unreflectedly represents all the social conventions and the prejudices of his class, and he's the one who unconsciously excludes Bloom. For example, there's his thoughtless harshness on the subject of suicide, which he considers the worst thing imaginable, the greatest shame that could befall a family. And he makes this statement in Bloom's presence, even though, which is hard for Bloom, because Bloom's father, we learn in this episode that Bloom's father obviously has committed suicide. And that is not out of malice on Power's part, he simply doesn't know, but it's not very tactful, because you never know whether in the context of the people you're talking to, a suicide might have happened. And so tactful restraint is not his strong suit. So savvy Joyce readers already know this, Mr. Powers, from the short story collection, The Dubliners, where he appears as a superficially charming but immature young man who is constantly in debt for unexplicable reasons. So he is not a very mature character, and here he stands more for his trivial platitudes that he contributes to the conversation. It's raining, but sure, the crops need it, and the sun is going to come out again. So Mr. Power does not get much more witty than that. And then there's Simon Dedalus, the earnestly humorous but failed patriarch who vacillates between proud fatherly love for his son Stephen, but also self-destructive alcoholism, and thereby exposing his family to ruin, but still maintaining sort of social decorum. And yeah, I think he's a windbag who achieves very little in real life. And I think very typical of him is the scene in which he describes his plans for all the strong words that he will use to give Buck Mulligan's aunt the boot. And anyone who has read the novel and Portrait of the Artist as a young man, anyone who has read this book, he will know that Simon Dedalus will not make good on any of it. It's just words. He will never have the strength to really say all these words to Buck Mulligan's. He will not be able to do it. So what was new to me was what I consider his sort of a cold-hearted stinginess towards the poor. So when it comes to the story of saving a person's life from drowning, and then the scandal that the family of the rescued man fobs off the poor rescuer with only 2 shillings, and he still considers that a shilling and 8 pence are too much. Okay, that's a very, very nasty character trait. Overall, I think it becomes clear that Bloom does not have a close relationship with any of the three. He remains an outsider, and Power does not really know him or and his story, and thus he unconsciously hurts him, and Cunningham essentially only feels pity for him, and Simon Delos largely ignores him totally. So, yeah, we also think there are other hints that Bloom is an outsider because we witness a conversation in the cemetery when 2 other men talk about Bloom, or rather about his wife Molly, and then they express their surprise or even contempt for Bloom by wondering how Molly could have married someone like him, such a loser. So we have an asymmetrical situation here. Bloom, he feels loyal to his acquaintances like Patrick Dignam, and he feels loyal up to the point that he attends the funeral, but this loyalty is not reciprocated by his acquaintances. They are not friends with him, so he seems really not to be part of the community of their circle, but a clear outsider, someone who is excluded, structurally excluded. Maybe because he has a Jewish origin, maybe because he's not that successful. Who knows? Okay, let's move on to the 3rd chapter of my video. Where are and what are the parallels to the Odyssey? What happens in the Odyssey, in the Hades episode? So, after Odysseus has defeated Circe and wants to travel home, Circe advises him to go to the realm of the dead and ask the prophet or seer Tiresias for advice on his journey home. And Odysseus follows this advice. He travels across the 4 rivers of Hades, and he sacrifices to the dead, and then the seer appears, and other people from the netherworld or from appear, and he learns, for example, of his mother's death that had occurred in the meantime. He encounters some old fallen comrades in arms and other dead heroes of the past. He learns that Poseidon, the god of the sea, wants to prevent his return, but that he ultimately will succeed and that he ultimately will have a long life and a happy homecoming. And he also receives a warning from the seer Tiresias not to kill the oxen of the sun god Helios on the island of Thrinacia. Okay, what does this all have to do with our episode? So I think, well, death and decay play a major role here. And the cemetery is, so to speak, the realm of the dead. It is watched over by a guardian, Hades, and it is a place in which one must face the shadows of the past, the heroes and companions of the past. They occur, Odyssey sees them, and we see them and their monuments on the cemetery, the heroes of the Irish history and the past, etc. I think this parallel is obvious. There is also some parallels that are more or less of the Easter egg hunt type. So, for example, that also Leopold Bloom, he crosses 4 rivers by carriage on his way to the realm of the dead, to his way to Glasnevin cemeteries, in a similar way as Odysseus crosses the 4 rivers of Hades, for example. Some characters can also be clearly identified as parallels to the Odyssey. So these Caretaker or Gravedigger or Connell as Hades himself, and Martin Cunningham as Sisyphus, who is constantly working with the same challenge every week again, and Simon Dedalus as Achilles, a character who is very extremely proud of his son, and so on. However, there's one key difference, and that there is no other 2 differences. One, there is no parallel figure to this prophet or seer Tiresias, and second, Leopold Bloom's gain in knowledge is different from the knowledge gained by Ulysses. The knowledge of that Leopold Bloom gains, it does not come from any supernatural powers or prophecies, but it comes from his own inner insights, his own thinking. And this also makes sense from the perspective of Joyce, of an author of literary modernism. So I think this is precisely the hallmark of modern man, that he no longer allows himself to be guided by supernatural, otherworldly, or transcendent beings, but must come to his or her own insights. So here we have another of those interesting passages where Joyce does not deliver a one-to-one parallel modern version of the Odyssey, but where he deliberately changes the perspective to make it better match the modern point of view or the situation of modern humanity. And so warnings such as the one not to slaughter cattle, they do not appear in this episode. So, but there are a few prophetic signs of later events. So there's this first sighting of Stephen Dedalus, and that is a prophecy of their later intense encounter, and also this exclusion by some of the mourners, that foreshadows an even more massive exclusion or discrimination of Leopold Bloom in a later episode, I think in the 12th episode. And also the sighting of Blaise Boylan, that reminds him that this threat to his marriage is real, that there will be this event probably in the afternoon when Blaise meets Molly and they will make love probably. So the central insight gained in this episode for Leopold Bloom is the sentence that he has developed within himself, and that I mentioned earlier. And although this sentence is inspired by a certain religious Christian tradition, it is not controlled by it, but it's controlled by his own thoughts, because for him it becomes central, this reversed version of the pious Christian saying, in the midst of life we are in death. And he chooses to use this reversed version as his leitmotif. In the midst of death, we are in life. So he's surrounded by death, but he nevertheless chooses life. So to summarize once again, instead of finding enlightenment in the sayings of an external force or a supernatural being, such a prophet or a seer or a visionary, Bloom's insight comes from his own painful encounter with the real world, and he leaves the realm of the dead, Glasnevin Cemetery, not with any supernatural prophecies, but with an answer that he has found himself to the question of what should be his attitude toward life and death. So I think the modernist punchline is that in a secularized world, there is no longer any prophet Tiresias figure, no visionaries or prophets to guide humanity based on supernatural insights from above. Bloom must gain his insights himself, and the many small signs he encounters in this episode, they are not a warning not to slaughter any cattle or so, but it's the sobering realization, yes, you are alone in this society. Molly's love affair is real, but you can and you must still choose life. And in the following episode, we will see how he deals with these insights. And are these self-fulfilling prophecies, or is that helpful? We'll see. Okay, let's move on to the fourth chapter, which is more a structural chapter about the structure of the 6 episodes so far, right? Because I think we have now reached a first structural turning point in the novel. So far, we have experienced 2 parallel strands of 3 episodes each. So first, we had these 3 episodes where we accompanied Stephen Dedalus from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. in 3 episodes, and then again from 8 to 11 a.m. on the same day, we accompanied Leopold Bloom. And now the path of the 2 have crossed for the first time, and there will be no more time leaps in the novel. Instead, the time will from now on unfold linearly from episode to episode. There will be no more parallel strands. If you take a closer look at the structural composition of the novel, a few things stand out. In addition to the temporal parallelism of the 2 strands of 3 episodes each, there are also a few parallels in terms of content and theme. And some of them have already been pointed out in the videos on previous episodes, and often also by you in the comments. For example, that a school plays a role at the same time in these parallel episodes, or a drowned body plays a role in both parallel episodes, etc. And for those who enjoy such structural games, here are a few more observations from my side. I think there is a parallelism in the category or type of location where the events take place. And the first episode of both strands takes place in enclosed domestic spaces. It's the Martell Tower in the Stephen Dedalus strand, and it's the Leopold Bloom house in Eckert Street in the Leopold Bloom strand. And the second episode of each strand, it takes place in institutional locations. It's the school, public spaces in Dublin. And then the third episode takes place in peripheral locations that are full of symbolic meaning. So like the beach, the sea, or the cemetery. So we have a movement from a closed private room to an institutional location or public one, and then peripheral locations with a high symbolic meaning. Then, regarding the individual episodes or couples of parallel episodes from the 2 strands. So in episode 1 and 4, so the first one for each character, Joyce emphasizes simultaneity through subtle parallels. So Stephen and Bloom, they both prepare breakfast for other people. Both are in mourning, and they wear dark mourning clothes, and both leave their homes without their keys. And then there are thematic parallels in the second episode of each strand. So in episode 2 and 5, both deal with passivity and numbness. So Stephen in this stifling school atmosphere under Mr. Deasy, and Bloom in his sluggish movement through Dublin. Also, institutional religion plays a role in these 2 parallel episodes. Stephen is confronted with Deasy's Christian Catholic orthodoxy, and Bloom observes a Catholic service. And letters and communication play a role in both parallel episodes. So Stephen is supposed to carry and to publish Mr. Deasy's letter, and Bloom, he receives Martha's letter. And then in the third episode of each strand, so in episode 3 and 6, there is probably the closest thematic connection through this topic of death and decay that plays a role in all these thoughts of Stephen. And of course, it's it's very crucial in the Hades episode. There are a few other overarching thematic patterns that connect Stephen and Bloom at this point. So one is this topic of the father figure. So Stephen seeks a spiritual father and he rejects his biological father. Bloom mourns his dead father, but he's also a mourning father. He mourns the death of his son. And then there's this topic of exile or homelessness. So Stephen is more or less displaced from Martello Tower, and Bloom is in a kind of exile in his own home. He's displaced from the marital bed by his wife's lover, Blazes Boylan. And also something that links these two characters is the relationship between body and mind. And these are rather complementary because Stephen approaches all the topics on the subjects from the perspective of the mind, from a very intellectual perspective. Leopold Bloom also thinks about things, but his natural reaction is more from the perspective of the body, of his senses. Okay, so wrapping all this up, I think ultimately we can see the first 6 episodes as a kind of a double exposition of the novel. Same time period, same city, same themes, but different social worlds, different individuals, different levels of learnedness and different temperaments, and 2 very different types of exiled characters whose experiences will now converge from this point on. Okay, a very short 5th chapter, an explanation or an apology that I cannot fulfill some readers' expectations. So it's about Irish and Dublin local colour. So this episode is densely packed with references and allusions to Irish history, Irish national heroes and villains, and Irish songs and poems and proverbs and nursery rhymes. And again, there are all these specific references to shops, to companies, to institutions, to streets and squares and monuments in Dublin that actually existed in Dublin in 1904. And this is described in very much detail. And I think Joyce once said that if Dublin were destroyed, it could be rebuilt based on his description in Ulysses. So that certainly is an exaggeration. But of course, Ulysses is quite explicitly a Dublin novel, a declaration of love and hate for the city. And if you read carefully how many specific locations are named during this carriage ride to the cemetery, you get a small impression of how well Joyce himself knew Dublin and how he could describe his Dublin even when being in exile in Trieste. So, but sadly enough, though, I am the wrong guide or the wrong tour guide for this novel when it comes to pointing out all these references and comparing them with today's reality. I know Dublin reasonably well, having been there at least, I think, 7 or 8 times, but I am not a Dublin enthusiast and certainly not a Dublin expert, and nor do I wish to be one. Personally, I find this part of the detective-like tracing of these local references not that interesting, and I do not expect to gain any particular insight from it, for me personally. But it's the reason why I will generally say little about it in my videos. So for all those viewers who miss this element, I'm really sorry, but I can't help it. It's just not my field of expertise and not my cup of tea. But of course, you're welcome to point it out to me in the comments if I overlook any points that are really crucial and important for understanding the novel. Just I may overlook this if it's related to this Dublin local conditions, because I have to admit I have certain sort of blinders that I'm wearing when I'm reading this novel, and I always welcome helpful additions and corrections. Okay, so having said that, let's move on to the last chapter of my video, which is not about the content of this section. It's a methodological one, and this was it's about all these all my explanations about and remarks about structure, parallels, symbolism, and it's a valid question, I think, to question whether all this really was consciously intended by Joyce when he wrote this novel, or whether we are reading too much into this novel and inventing layers of meaning that were not created by Joyce? And this is a question that has come up in the comments section on previous videos. And I think it's a very valid and important question, but it is a one that where I have a very clear position on it, and I would not like to leave this unanswered. And so I'd like to present my personal view on it here. Just as my personal point of view, I do not claim that this is the perfect and valid and the only truth, but it's my personal point of view. Let me start with a sort of looking back into history. When I was in school, okay, 40 years ago, the analysis and interpretation of texts was still based on the premise that there was such a thing as a single correct pre-existing sense or meaning of a literary work or a literary text, meaning that the author had conceived or constructed or concocted and then artfully packaged in language in a in a complicated way, and that now the task of the interpreter or the reader was now to find this one meaning, this author's intention, by correctly unpacking, unboxing, or correctly decoding the language. So that was the common or the only approach that I learned when I was in school 40 years ago. But actually, in literary studies, this approach is considered totally outdated and inappropriate, and for a couple of good reasons. Let me outline a few of these reasons. First, there is absolutely no way for us to really know the author's intention with any real reliability or certainty. So because even what the author states as the meaning of the novel, it may not be correct. You have no way of verifying it. Perhaps he or she remembers incorrectly, or perhaps he or she deliberately wants to mislead the reader. We have no means to validate this, to verify it. And second is language is the mechanism. I think that's even stronger argument that language has hit its mechanism of itself that generate meaning according to its own rules, independent of what an author or on top of what an author is trying to create. That means that linguistic works of art, they have several possible meanings, not just the one intended by the author. And this can be clearly demonstrated by a lot of examples in metaphors and allegories, or in other rhetorical figures, in anagrams or in Freudian slips. They all show that these elements have mechanisms of their own that construct additional levels of meaning through their own logic, levels of meaning. And even if, especially if they are combined, then the effect multiplies. And these are levels of meaning which have more to do with the mechanisms of language and with the perception of the reader than with the intention of the author. So, and the third thing is that literary studies have come to the understanding that the meaning of a literary work is always a construction of the reader. So, and the author is playing a secondary or tertiary role. Some say the author is just the first reader of his own work. So, in literary studies, they really talk about different readings of a work, which is, not to be confused with the word reading as it is used in editorial studies, where this means just different versions of a text that may exist due to different traditions. But here, reading is a version of a sense of the text constructed by the reader in his or her act of reading the text and making sense of all the language symbols in the text. So this might be a little bit confusing, but what all this means is that the question of whether the interpretation we are developing here, whether this also accurately reflects the meaning that Joyce intended when he was writing this novel, this is actually a question that is no longer asked in literary studies, or at least it's not considered the most important question, because we simply cannot know Joyce's intentions, and it's neither compelling nor plausible that only the meaning intended by Joyce is the only meaning of this work of art that has a right to exist. So it makes no sense to seek and to identify a single pre-existing meaning hidden in the text. So it cannot be ruled out that there are many other valid meanings or readings of the text besides the one intended by the author. So the only thing that is sensible to do is to closely examine any interpretations or readings, to examine them for internal plausibility and for compatibility with the text. So if there is sufficient supportive evidence in the text for a given interpretation. So because that there can be multiple meanings to a text, this does not mean that the door is now open to a complete arbitrariness, and to that doesn't mean that any interpretation, no matter how far-fetched, is equally valuable and valid. No, not at all. So of course, yeah, you're free to do as you please in your reading chair at home, but in order for an interpretation or a reading to be accepted as meaningful, or let's say accepted as professional in literary studies by the professionals, a few criteria have been established. There are several sets of these criteria around. I've broken down these into 7 points, and they were essentially inspired by Umberto Eco's essay, The Limits of Interpretation. Let me outline these 7 criteria roughly. The first one is verifiability in the text. And this has, again, 3 sub-aspects. So the interpretation must be based on specific passages in the text. It must not contradict the text, and it should not only work if central elements of the text are ignored. So it must be verifiable with taking the whole text into consideration. The second criterion is internal coherence. So the interpretation must be consistent and free of contradictions or logical errors. So it's not just a mumble jumble of individual observations and statements. They all must fit together to form a coherent overall picture. The third criterion is on complexity and explanatory power. A good interpretation not only captures individual aspects of a text, but it also reflects its level of complexity and its multi-layered nature, and it really adds some explanation to the text. And the fourth one is compatibility with the context. So the historical, the cultural context, etc. So an interpretation should take into account the relevant context of the text and its origin. It may be historical or cultural or genre-specific or biographical, etc. So a Marxist interpretation in a Shakespeare sonnet, probably not the best idea, quite difficult to justify. And the fifth criterion is intersubjective comprehensibility. So it's a monster of a word. So, but it means that the interpretation should be derived in a way that is methodologically transparent and comprehensible. So in a way that you can describe the method you used in a way that others can come to the same conclusion if they apply your method. And if they look at the arguments presented, they can come to the same conclusion without any secret knowledge or gut feeling or divine inspiration or irrationality. So interpretation is not a secret science, it's a methodological work. And the sixth point is productivity in discourse. That a valid reading or interpretation, or a good interpretation or reading, it tells something new, and it opens up new perspectives on the text. It can be related to other existing interpretations, and it can thus raise new further questions and surprising questions. So good interpretations make our understanding of a text richer and broader, and they promote further dialogue about a piece of literary work. And Seventh, it's the adequateness of the method. So the methods used for analyzing and interpreting the text, they should be adequate to the text and also to the question we are trying to answer by applying these methods. So, simple example, counting syllables and analyzing rhyme schemes is probably not the right method, not appropriate for every text, but only for specific ones. Okay, so those are 7 criteria by which that have proven to be helpful in the literary studies. And I think these are criteria by which also everything that I say here about Ulysses could be measured and should be measured. Of course, this is not a literary studies project. If I wanted to interpret the episodes according to strict literary standards, and each of these videos would have to be several hours long, and it would have extensive footnotes and a bibliography, and I would only be able to produce one video every 6 months at most. Of course, this is an amateur project, a homespun version of close reading by an interested reader for other interested amateur readers. And I am far from complying with the academic standards of literary studies here in terms of textual evidence and disclosure of my methods. But still, I feel sort of committed to these quality standards and quality criteria when preparing and developing my thoughts on these episodes. And I try to adhere to them, which is only possible to a limited extent in this format, as it's also meant to be a bit entertaining and not a dry academic text, of course, but I try to adhere to it as far as possible. And if I fail, I'm always grateful. And when I point out some where my sloppiness or mistakes or over interpretations where my imagination went wild. Okay, after so much about the theory of interpretation, let's now return to Joyce and Ulysses and to the original question whether all these structural and symbolic refinements that we find here and the interpretations, are we not reading more into the text than Joyce put into it? That was the question. And so the first part of my answer to this question, I think, should now be clear. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that much what Joyce put in it. The one thing that does matter is whether what we read out of the text, whether this can be methodically proven from the text, and whether this is coherent in itself and fulfills all the 7 criteria I mentioned, then it can be considered a valid interpretation or a valid reading in terms of literary studies. However, the second part of my answer is even more specific, because in Joyce's case, there is actually strong evidence that complex interpretations, parallels to the Odyssey, philosophical themes, artistic symbolism, and all these advanced narrative and montage techniques were deliberately used and created by him. First argument is the Gilbert scheme and the Linati scheme are these 2 tabular aids for deciphering the novel, which Joyce designed for his friends and acquaintances. So that's a clear admission on his part that the novel needs to be deciphered, that hidden symbols and colors and organs and linguistic techniques, they were deliberately used by the author in a way that requires some detective work to decipher or to be detected. And the second argument are Joyce's own quotes about the structural and thematic and symbolic complexity of Ulysses. He wrote about this in his letters to his friends. For example, in a letter to his friend Carlo Linati on September 21st, 1920, he wrote, "In view of the enormous scope and more than enormous complexity of my damned monster novel, my intention is not only to present the myth in the light of our time, but also to let each adventure, that is, each hour, each organ, each art, which are interconnected and interrelated in the somatic scheme of the whole, let it determine and even create its own narrative technique." Or in a letter to Frank Budgeon about the episode The Cattle of Helios, a letter dated from March 20, 1920, Joyce wrote, "It's a mathematical catechism in which all events are dissolved into their cosmic, physical, psychic, etc. equivalents. Okay, so for me, these statements prove quite clearly that the enormous complexity is deliberate and that the various levels of symbolism, such as the references to organs and artistic disciplines and the various levels of language, all these are deliberately interwoven in a very delicate way, and that the numerous parallels between this physical and psychological and philosophical and cosmic meanings of individual words and terms and actions, that were all deliberately created by Joyce. Okay, so I hope I have been able to clarify this a bit, also to answer these valid and doubtful question whether this is legitimate, this way of interpretation that we are doing. Yes, there is a lot of complexity that can be read into this novel, but A, Joyce seems to have actually intended this, and B, there are practical quality criteria from distinguishing valid and coherent interpretations or readings from purely speculative figments of the imagination. But nevertheless, vigilance and critical thinking, they are also, of course, appropriate and always needed. Admittedly, there is a great temptation. So once you have had a somewhat offbeat interpretative idea, you fall in love with this idea, and then you perceive everything selectively through the lens of or through the glasses and the perspective of this idea, and then you get carried away in your interpretation because you ignore important textual elements and test criteria that might easily dismantle or disprove your interpretation. And I cannot absolve myself of this either. So that's a temptation that's always there for anyone who analyzes and interprets text. So, but that's why I have you to point this out to me if it happens. So that's the beauty and the charm of such collective reading projects. Okay, that's it for today. We have reached the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you have enjoyed it. Please let me know in the comments how you think about what I've been saying today. So hope to see you next time in about 3 weeks. And in the meantime, have a great reading time. Take care. Bye bye and ciao.